Hello and welcome to lesson number 12 of Architecture, History and Theory. And as I have mentioned to you before, the previous lessons, they had this focus on architecture, history and theory from the point of view, from the perspective of embodiment. And so for this last lesson, I'm not really giving any more theoretical content. We had this overview, which started with Vitruvius, and we came all the way to the 21st century and to the theories of embodiment and neuroscience, and how these have been influencing architecture theory, but also architectural practice. And so today, for the last lesson, I have planned to give you an overview of literature, which is specifically connected to the topic of architecture and embodiment. So I have here some recommendations from many of the authors, which I will be showing you some books about today. They have been developing these ideas and these theories of around the body and architecture, and also the senses, perception. So they have been working with these topics already for a long time. They have been inspired by the theories of empathy that we mentioned, that were mentioned also in the previous lessons, and also by phenomenology, and now more recently cognitive sciences and neurosciences. So there's a lot of architecture, history and theory in the background of the work of these authors, and also of course philosophy. So I will start with Juhani Pallasmaa, and this is his book. I hope you can see it from the light. It's called The Eyes of the Skin, Architecture and the Senses. And this is it's a small book, but it's a wonderful book. Juhani Pallasmaa really writes about architecture and this kind of how architecture is to be experienced with the senses, and also how architecture is not just construction, but it's about this creation of meaning and representation of our existential human needs. So there's many aspects which Pallasmaa addresses, and specifically about the multisensory aspect of the experience of architecture. So he talks about, he writes about, for example, the fixation that architecture has, specifically since modernist architecture, this extreme focus on the eye, and also continues with architectural representation, very focused on drawing, on photography. And Juhani Pallasmaa really makes this defense of the senses, and especially about the intimacy in haptics and the dimension of touch, and also of sense, of the scent and of listening to architecture. So these atmospheric qualities about experiencing architectural space. He also talks about, of course, the sense, besides the sense of touch and scent. He also talks about action and how kinesthesis, or the sense of movement, directly influences our experience of architecture, and how movement through space and our own mimesis or bodily identification with space is so important for also for our well-being, and for to develop this notion of empathy we mentioned before, empathy with spaces, but also at the same time how we experience space through our bodies, and how our body is the medium of all this experience. And most of all, how architecture, and especially good architecture, should address all these different sensory dimensions, to give us what we as humans need as important sensorial enriching experiences. So in a very small book, which I really recommend, Juhani Pallasmaa really addresses all these questions, and it's a wonderful way to start addressing this topic of the experience of architectural space. And also the metaphor, the eyes of the skin, is already wonderful, because it really brings to attention that we don't see only with our eyes, we see with our whole body, and we are feeling, sensing creatures, and this is how we also construct meaning in our individual personal experience of being in the world. So wonderful book. This was my first recommendation. Juhani Pallasmaa also references often in his work, and especially in The Eyes of the Skin, this book by Stine Eile Rasmussen. It's a bit an earlier book called Experiencing Architecture, which interestingly enough, there's here the figure of the modular. Of course, Le Corbusier was in trouble, and also Pallasmaa also criticizes Le Corbusier, but in fact Le Corbusier was also looking for, as I mentioned before, scientific aesthetics. So he was trying to understand. He was also very interested in corporeality in architecture, but at the same time he was very interested in standards, and he was very interested in establishing one normalization of architecture, which of course was more connected to his own experience of his own body. So he didn't really have this inclusive, diversive perspective on architecture. But in any case, Le Corbusier was also, of course, interested in working with these topics. So here in the book of Rasmussen, Experiencing Architecture, we have, just to give an overview of the contents, he talks about aspects of the experience of architecture. For example, the contrasting effects of solids and cavities in building. Also, architecture experienced as color, scale and proportion, rhythm in architectural, textural effects, daylight in architecture, and hearing in architecture. So all these aspects that of course have to do with the design, but written from this perspective of experience. So I definitely also recommend this book if you are interested in trying to learn more about architecture from this point of view of the experience of architecture. And of course I mentioned this in the context of architecture history, and I can show you that it's not far-fetched that this book, for example, Experiencing Architecture, is full of images of historical buildings. And you see here, as we had in the lesson before, the modular and the Vitruvian Man. And I even have a mark here on this page, Le Corbusier's Unité de Marseille. So there's many references to the topics we mentioned before. Of course, to prepare the literature review, many of the books I have, many of the topics I have addressed were specifically mentioned by having read and prepared the texts with these books. So this is also for you to know the sources of the literature, and if you want to go deeper into the topic someday, or if you're interested, I definitely recommend. So Experiencing Architecture, and actually I wanted to show now in sequence 3 more books by Juhani Pallasmaa, but since we are talking about experience, I will make another jump for one. I think this is the most recent book of the books I have recommended for you, and it's by Harry Francis Mulgrave, who I mentioned very much during the last talks, the work of Professor Mulgrave, who is really writing about writing the history and theory of architecture, in my opinion. And he wrote this book, From Object to Experience, The New Culture of Architectural Design. And in this book, Mulgrave really addresses all these topics we have mentioned before about the experience of architecture, but also not just about the topic of embodiment. Actually, that was the focus of his previous book, which I have here, and I will talk about it afterwards. But really, architecture as the in a broader sense. So architecture as the practice of culture, also addressing the new models of perception and of aesthetics, which now are arising because we have this new knowledge also that comes from neuroscience and cognitive sciences, and also from a more philosophical point of view, how can we directly address through history and theory what is a feeling for space, a feeling for form, what creates an atmosphere, the atmosphere of a place, the importance of storytelling and architecture, and also the importance of rituals. So this book of Mulgrave about experience expands this idea of Rasmussen, which is very focused on aspects of the building, so really through the elements of building. And Mulgrave expands this idea by bringing it a broader scope within, from the viewpoint of culture. And so there's a lot of references to behavior, to human behavior, always in connection to architectural design, but of course also historical references to buildings, but a very, very strong focus on atmosphere, on the creation of atmospheres through building. And so this connection also of the atmospheres with the topic of storytelling, of the narratives we construct when we design and when we are performing in the built environment. So also regarding the topic of experience, of course this topic of experience now is doing a strong revival or reappearance in architectural history and theory, contemporary theory of architecture, also through the influence of neuroscience, as I constantly mentioned. So this was also a book from Harry Francis Mulgrave, Architecture and Embodiment, the implications of the new sciences and humanities for design. So in this book, Mulgrave really talks explicitly about the developments, recent developments of neuroscience and cognitive sciences. It's very interesting because it's written for architects, so that this is the audience, but it really has references from neuroscience. So it talks about emotion, it talks about the experience of architecture with reference to the theories of empathy, but it really addresses the work of neuroscientists like Penskep and Damasio. The question, like we mentioned in the videos before, about feelings and emotions and architecture, and how this is connected to the workings of the brain, and also some references to the idea of beauty and a possible foundation of a neuroaesthetics, so an aesthetics which has which we can explain through biological interpretation of biological theory, and already here an overview of the importance of playing and ritual, and already this transition to the cultural aspects. So all this connected this idea with this idea of embodiment, of how we experience architecture and how we make sense and we shape the built environment from embodied biological point of view. And also, of course, many considerations from the point of view of architectural history and theory. Mulgrave is very well informed on history and theory of architecture, so there's a lot of reference here. All this work I told you about before with the theories of empathy and the experiments which were done in Hellerau and at the Bauhaus, and so Mulgrave really picks up all these historical references and weaves them together, so that we can see that already in the very beginnings or through the development of architectural history and theory, there were already many authors who were interested in trying to understand how the body and the brain work and the implications that this has in architectural design. So I definitely also would suggest that this is a good way to learn about this topic. Another book which is a little bit more pragmatic, I would say, not so focused on history, is Cognitive Architecture by Anne Sussman and Justin B. Hollander, designing how we respond to the built environment. And here there are also many interesting considerations. Of course, sometimes some of these authors don't agree with everything, so you see that there's also different approaches, but there's definitely a culture in architecture history and theory, and especially in research, that goes in this direction. So this book, Cognitive Architecture, also proposes a new foundation for architecture, which has references to the work of Darwin, biology, and cognitive science. And then there's many aspects. This is a more practical book, in a way similarly to what Rasmussen's did with experiencing architecture. This book also goes to aspects of design and building, or parameters, and gives examples of such parameters in building that really show implications from the point of view of cognitive sciences. So, for example, the question of the edges, so edges in a building, and how we as humans have a tendency to, they say here, wall hugging, so to stay closer to the walls, and it's explained that we are a little bit space shy, so with of course exceptions, but most people don't have a tendency for approaching a new space and immediately being in the center or staying in the center for a long time. So hugging the wall actually has a biological reason. It has to do with a sense of protection, with a sense of being in a new environment and wanting to feel sheltered and surrounded, and this is a survival strategy, so it's a natural instinct. So for example, another case study, so the book addresses these topics with different case studies. Another case study has to do with patterns, and it's an explanation of how, in terms of perception, we interpret patterns, and the authors make a comparison between faces, how we perceive faces and spaces, and how these rules of perception can be transported from, for example, how we perceive a face as friendly or unfriendly, and how we transpose the same kind of model of perception, for example, to judge how we feel about a building, the facade of a building. So, and there is pictures, and this is explained why, and a little bit on how it can work. There's a theory for it, but also other considerations, for example, about symmetry, the effect of symmetry in the brain, how we perceive symmetry, curves, and complexity. Also a chapter which is dedicated to narrative and to storytelling, so similarly to what Mulgrave, and a proposal for biophilia and biophilic design, which would be to try to find principles in design that follow the laws of nature. So there are of course some references to design which uses fractals and other strategies that try to use what we learn and what we can learn and what we know about nature to and replicate this kind of proportions in the art of building. And as you learned already in the previous lessons, of course, already the Egyptians and in the Renaissance and so these geometric forms and these patterns which are recurrently found in nature, they were used in building, and of course because they can also be found in the human body. So for example, here we have the golden spiral and all these things which can be used, which are proposed here, can be used as a strategy to design in a way that it references nature and therefore is closer to our bodies and to our biological disposition to feel good and to have well-being in the environment. Another book that directly addresses this topic is this one here, Beauty, Neuroscience and Architecture, Timeless Patterns and Their Impact on Our Well-Being. And it's by Donald H. Ruggles. And it's also a nice and interesting, very concise book. And it also addresses exactly these topics, such as emotional bonding to a place. So this book has a less practical focus as the book before. It's more about it has a more poetic approach to this topic of neuroscience and architecture. So it talks about beauty, about the beauty in nature with reference to fractals, for example, and also some references, for example, to strategies for design, like the 9-square model, and some references of geometric patterns that can be used to replicate the patterns in nature. And the theory in the book is that by replicating these patterns of nature, we are using rules in design that can be closer to our human body, or can be closer to what we perceive as more natural. And there's here a few examples. Like I mentioned before, also in this book you see a facade and how a facade is organized by this 9-square grid, and also here the same analysis in a face and overlapped with the building. So in this case, so that we can perceive a building as if we would perceive a face, and then choosing what can be more pleasant and closer to what we would find joy, and what would improve our sense of well-being in space. And what I find very interesting also about this book is that there's references, for example, to classical painting, and how the same strategy was used in classical painting, but also in historical buildings. So we have here, for example, how in the Parthenon we have also the use of this geometric pattern, and here we have also reference to the Aztec temples and the pyramids. So it's really interesting because in this very small book, the 9-square pattern is really presented as something that appears recurrently in sacred buildings, for example, but in different cultures, different civilizations, with many centuries in between, and that these patterns were used. And then near the end, there's more scientific considerations. I find that the strong point of this book is really more the poetic aspect, and also the historical references. I think that the scientific part is not so deeply developed, but I also don't think that was the point of the book. I think the point was more mentioned exactly to give an overview of these timeless patterns and their impact on our well-being. So the whole idea of the book is to introduce this concept of well-being, how we can feel well through the built environment, and some considerations about nature and these patterns, and how we can consciously use them to build good design. So another book I would like to recommend now, it's called Mind in Architecture, Neuroscience, Embodiment and the Future of Design. And this is a collection of papers, and it was edited by Sarah Robinson and Juhani Balasma, who I mentioned before. And this is how the book looks like, Mind in Architecture. and it's also a very thorough overview around these topics. And there's many texts by by many authors, including Harry Francis Mulgrave, also John Paul Eberhard, who was the founder of the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture, and who unfortunately passed away this week due to coronavirus complications. So John Paul Eberhard really he also wrote a book about architecture and neuroscience. I don't have it here, I only have it on a PDF, but I definitely recommend. This was the first book that introduced me to the topic of architecture and neuroscience, and it really it can really open the mind to really see these connections between how the built environment affects our mind and affects our body, and how we as designers, we are not just doing things that people enjoy. We are, through the built environment, we are shaping people's habits and shaping our brains. We shape our brains by shaping our environment, and then they shape it. So we shape our environment, and then the environment shapes us back. And this is a line that we hear often in the community of architecture and neuroscience, and it's a sentence by Winston Churchill. But it's really on the spot. We shape our environment, and our environment shapes us back. This is and neuroscience really shows this more and more. So, but returning to this book, of course, there's also articles from other authors. For example, Alberto Pérez Gómez, who also writes a lot, similarly to Juhani Palasma, but also Stephen Hall and Peter Zumthor, who write about atmospheres in architecture. Alberto Pérez Gómez, for example, in this book, he writes about mood and meaning in architecture. He also wrote recently a book about the attunement in architecture, so this capacity that we have to feel synchronized with other people and synchronized with the built environment, and having this sense of also a sense of community. So the topics addressed in this book are many. So architecture and neuroscience, embodied simulation, intuition, immersion, mood and meaning in architecture, surviving through design. This is a reference to the architect Richard Neutra, who wrote a book in the 70s called Survival Through Design. The influence and the importance of biological sciences and how they can inform the practice of architecture, meaning in architecture, the imagination, and also using neuroscience in the design process. Another contributor to this article is the neuroscientist Michael Arbib, who is also in the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture, and I would definitely recommend the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture. ENFA has a conference every 2 years on the topic of neuroscience and architecture, and really makes very strong work with many people from all over the world who are really dedicating research to this topic with many different approaches, many different methods, and also very interesting cross-disciplinary projects. So we have influences from history and theory, from philosophy, from neuroscience, cognitive sciences, people who work in architecture practice, so who deal with these topics, but also with a very practical approach. So to approach specific problems in design, and specific problems that we can address through design. So, and picking up this thread, another book I would recommend, it's by John Zeisel, and it's called Inquiry by Design. Also has a preface by John P. Eberhard, who I just mentioned before. And I come to this book now, Inquiry by Design, and it's about environment, behavior, neuroscience in architecture for interiors, landscape, and planning. And this book, this is a little bit a bigger book. It's really about research on this topic, applied research, and we have many case studies and many approaches in the field of neuroscience and cognitive sciences to study the built environment with a scientific approach. So not just theory, but really, for example, post occupancy evaluation, using questionnaires, using emotion measurement methodologies like machines that are also used in neuroscience. So many different approaches. And also case studies. That's how I came now to this references. To this reference, also case studies on how we can use this knowledge to apply it to specific situations in architecture. For example, to improve the quality of life of people who have diseases such as Alzheimer. This is directly addressed in the book, and how we already know through research. By understanding the disease and of course by understanding the human brain, how we can optimize and how we can improve the environment so that it's easier for someone with Alzheimer's to live and to have some quality of life through space. And there's many also references to theory of perception. Very experimental work, but also very very detailed. So I would recommend this. This one is more focused on research and applied research. So I would say perhaps a little bit more advanced reading, but definitely also interesting. And since I was mentioning ENFA, or the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture before, this is also, she's Sarah Williams Goldhagen. She's also a member of the Academy for Neuroscience for Architecture. And this book is called Welcome to Your World, How the Built Environment Shapes Our Lives. So it really picks up this idea of how the Winston Churchill quote, how we shape our environment and our environment shapes us back. Sarah Williams Goldhagen, she's one of America's most important architecture critics, and she discusses how the built environment really shapes our feelings, memories, and well-being. And she also makes a defense on how important it is that we take advantage of the knowledge of neurosciences and cognitive sciences to understand that it's so important to build based on some standards, that we start to understand what and how impacts the human body, so we can start really designing to foster a sense of well-being and more human-centered design. So many interesting topics are addressed in this book. So for example, the experience of the built environment, the bodily basis of cognition, so how everything about cognition, of course, happens through our body, the body situated in the natural world, people embedded in the social world, designing for humans, and from blind side to inside. So instead of designing without knowing exactly what we're doing, just by trial and error and seeing, oh, perhaps it works, let's see if it works, to insight, to actually understanding through knowledge, through solid knowledge, how it works and how our brain works, how our body works, and how we can use this knowledge to improve life and to improving lives through enriching the built environment. And enriching in this sense of giving through the built environment what we need as humans, not just to survive, but to thrive, to prosper, and to be happy. So in chapter 1, she called it The Sorry Places We Live. And I specifically love this chapter because Sarah Williams Goldhagen really makes this very clear exposition that there's so many places in the world that are not designed at all, or have so many people in the world live in such horrible, derelict conditions, and how this completely degrades them as human beings, and doesn't allow them to develop and to flourish, and this is a consequence of the built environment. So this should definitely be addressed through design, if we actually want to change the world, and if we want to make a world which is more equal and more sustainable and more human. We definitely could learn and start applying this knowledge. So, in the last 3 books I would also like to recommend to you. They are also from Juhani Palasma, and they extend his theory of the senses and of experiencing architecture. And Juhani Palasma is very, very focused on this idea of not just the vision as the main focus or main aspect of perception of architecture, but the whole multisensory experience. So this book is called The Thinking Hand: Existential and Embodied Wisdom in Architecture, and it directly addresses the topic of the hand and touch, and there's many references to the importance of the hand in drawing, and the connection between the hand, the eye, the brain, and the development of language, and the importance of touch, and how we learn through touch and we connect through touch. And of course there's many historical references to buildings and to art, and also a connection to the act of creating and designing through making with the hand. So this connection between creativity and drawing with the hand, and exploring an architectural design solution through doing the model with the hand, or something you can touch, something that has scale, and that also has a feeling of the properties of the material. So all these topics are addressed here, and many more. So another reference, this book is called The Embodied Image: Imagination and Imagery in Architecture. And in this book, this one is more conceptual, and it discusses again the topic of the image in architecture, and expands again the idea of the image just as something that we perceive with the eye, but it goes to the poetic dimension of an image, and it makes many references to art, and it also talks about the architectural image as something that brings a world also in itself, and some interesting connections also to archetypes, and how we perceive, and we also construct images in architecture to really evoke these ideas we have. For example, the house, the connection between the house and the human body, and here Palasma makes some connections to the art of the surrealists, and how these archetypes often are evoked, but also connecting to the ideas on the unconscious, and how many of these archetypes that we experience in architecture, they are already, that we experience and that we do in design, that they reflect patterns and ideas and visions that we can find in different cultures, and also different time periods. So not necessarily the patterns we saw in this other book by Donald H. Ruggles, Beauty, Neuroscience and Architecture. So more these archetypal images that we somehow have in our collective unconscious. So, and just to finish, another reference by Juhani Palasma, The Architecture of Image: Existential Space in Cinema. And again, here Palasma talks about the image. What is so interesting about the work of Palasma is that it seems like a paradox or a contradiction that he really constantly brings to our attention, that we should not be just focused on architecture on the eye. And then he talks about the image. And at first we could say, but an image is something we perceive with the eye. But Palasma is constantly talking about the image not as just something that we see, but something that we experience, and something that creates in us a sense of atmosphere, a sense of meaning that has symbolic connotations. And so in this book, he makes this reference to the image by discussing film. And in these images of film, we have, of course, storyboards, and we have all these wonderful images that have a very strong atmospheric and architectural character, because they really transport an idea of experience. And of course, this is also what's so important in architecture. It's about creating images. In architectural representations, we create images that can give us an idea of the experience we want to create with the building, or with the interior space, or with the city, but also that represent our own existential embodied human condition. So I also would recommend this book about existential space in cinema, and how, by understanding existential space in cinema, how we can transpose this to existential space in architectural space. And of course, Palasma also makes many references to philosophy, psychoanalysis, and of course, architecture, history, and theory in this book. And this was the last recommendation. It was my great pleasure to prepare this cycle of lectures to you. It was also an experiment for me, a new format. This was the first time that I'm doing online teaching, and it's the first time I do a YouTube channel. This was all a very quick decision that came now as a solution to the corona crisis. But I would like the channel, and I would like this platform. I intend to make this platform to continue to be a learning platform, to keep it open, so that everyone who wants to learn about architecture and design, and the implications about body, architecture, and the environment, and the new considerations of neuroscience and cognitive sciences, that can come to this channel and have an opportunity to learn, and also to share. So yes, I hope you found this useful and interesting, and I hope that you subscribe and you continue to explore and expand and share knowledge on these topics. Thank you.